Привет всем, с вами я, Janie, and this is College Russian. This is the continuation of the videos we've been doing talking about the cases in Russian, and today's video is the video I promised with some information that's going to explode your brain. So I hope you stay tuned. This should be pretty interesting. Do you ever find yourself asking, why did I have to fall in love with such a complicated language? Or why couldn't I just be content with Spanish like everybody else? Why did I have to go and choose Russian? Or more importantly, do you ever find yourself asking when your teacher tells you something needs a certain case, you say, but why? Like as if they themselves came up with that rule. Or maybe you're a super deep thinker and you've been thinking, well, why does English not have cases, but Russian and some other languages do? Well, today is the day you're going to get answers to those questions. Okay, so if you're looking at this chart here and you don't necessarily know what it's about, that probably means you still have maintained a little bit of innocence and you haven't learned about the Russian cases. Well, I will give you a quick introduction to them today and hopefully it will be interesting and gentle. And then in the next video, I'll talk about when and how you should start learning the Russian cases. So, Russian cases are when the ends of adjectives and nouns change in order to convey a certain meaning. So, as I mentioned in previous videos, Russian uses cases, whereas English depends heavily on word order. Word order is not optional or flexible in English. And then we have a lot more prepositions in English than Russian does. So, let's look at 3 example Russian sentences. Okay, so right here we have Mama любит папу. Папу любит мама. Папу мама любит. So, if you've got a very English-speaking brain, you're going to look at these and think they say, Mom loves Dad, Dad loves Mom, and Dad Mom loves. So, that's a little confusing, but guess what? The reason you did that is because your English brain thinks the word order here is important. Now, if you know Russian, you're looking at the ends of these words to figure out who's loving whom. So the translation of all 3 of these sentences is, get ready, Mom loves Dad. They're all 3 the same sentence. Can you believe that? And that's all because of the way we changed the ends of the words. So another example of Russian cases is they are used to further elaborate on already existing prepositions. So for example, we have 2 sentences here, and they both are using the same preposition, this v. However, they have different meanings. So, трудно ездить в Москву versus трудно ездить в Москве. So the first one means it's difficult to drive to Moscow. And then the second one, no, that's not a typo on the end of Moscow. It's a different meaning. The second one means it's difficult to drive in Moscow. So again, you can see how Russian uses those endings of the words to create additional meaning that in English, we just had a separate word for. So now that we've talked about that, you're probably saying, but why? Why? Like that you're feeling anger. Well, why? Why does it have to be like that? Why? Well, I think the bigger question to ask is why English doesn't do this. And today we're going to find out. And I'm going to tell you something that's going to completely explode your brain. Okay, real quick. I know there's going to be a whole bunch of you, those will actually people who are wanting to say, no, English does still have cases. I versus me, he versus him. It versus its, etc. Yes, that's true. But compared to what used to be in English, that's not very much left. And then also, if you speak Spanish, Spanish still has the indirect personal pronouns and then also the prepositional case left, but only in pronouns. So, quick interesting fact. This comes from this amazing book that I read, probably one of my most favorite books I've ever read on Audible. And it's like a lecture series. I highly recommend it to anybody who's learning English or any English speaker. And it's the history of the English language. So in this book, I found out that English used to have cases. English used to have gender of nouns and cases. But interestingly, they disappeared at a very significant moment in time. So this is from what's called the Peterborough Chronicle. And I just want you to notice that over the course of less than 100 years, the cases completely disappear in English. So as of 1083, we have, and this is Old English script, but thanks to the audible version of the book, I know how to pronounce all of this. This is a chronicle written by monks. So they're very literate, they're very educated, and the chronicle starts in 1083, on thisam year. On thisam year. So this is a case. Thisam is a case ending. Year. The e on the end of that is a case ending. So meaning in this year, on this year. Now we skip ahead to 1135, 50 years ahead. And the this has lost its ending. And we have on this year. The noun still has its ending, but the adjective has lost its ending. And then get ready, this is where your brain starts to explode. Less than 100 years later, the monks that are writing in this chronicle are not using cases at all. On this year, completely gone from English. Completely gone in 100 years. So what happened in history that suddenly made cases completely irrelevant? Well, for those of you history nerds, what happened in 1066? The Norman invasion of England. So the French, the Norman French, invade England. They kind of take over as the ruling elite. And their language was completely different from English. I mean, not completely different, but whereas when there was the Norse invasion, it was more mutually intelligible with Old English. They could understand each other. Well, this Norman French, people didn't understand each other. So something had to give. And guess what? The French Normans were in power, so English had to give. English lost its grammar completely. It lost its cases. It lost its grammatical gender because the gender of nouns in English, Old English, didn't line up with the gender of nouns in French. So they just said, yeah, screw it. It's not worth it. Let's not worry about it. So this is super interesting that the language, Norman French was the language of the elite. And so the only way for you to get up in society was to learn their language. Not to mention, nobody really cared about speaking English correctly anymore because it wasn't a powerful language anymore. So poof, 100 years, the cases are gone in English. Can you believe that? So now you're thinking, okay, well, if I just wait 100 years, maybe I won't have to learn the Russian cases because they won't exist anymore. Well, it's a little tricky because if you think about it, the Russians have been conquered and invaded before by the Mongol Tatars in around the same time as the Norman conquest in about 13th century. Well, we'll talk a little bit later in the video about why did Russian maintain its cases even though it was conquered by a different language family. And English didn't. Oh, stay tuned. There's a great explanation for that. So let's go ahead then and plug my Patreon because I work hard and I have a wonderful group of patrons supporting me over there. And not only does it warm my heart when people become patrons, but I think you get a few cool perks, such as a weekly conversation club, access to translation or grammar help anytime you need it via our Discord group, a monthly newsletter, as well as all sorts of fun little grammar and vocabulary tidbits that you might ever need to use. So please go ahead and find me over at Patreon. The link is down in the description box below. It means the world to me. I love all of you who have made that donation there. And again, it means so much to know that what I'm doing here matters to somebody. So let's go back to the Historical Linguistics, which is one of my favorite courses in college, is why languages change over time. So Russian, as well as English and German and Greek, Farsi, all of the Baltic languages, all of the Slavic languages, they are what are called Indo-European languages. That Proto-Indo-European ancestor actually had very complex grammar, a complex system of cases. And in fact, you can see them left over in some of the Indo-European languages. Obviously, all of the Slavic languages, except for two, see if you know which two, as well as Greek and German and some other languages that maybe I'm not aware of. Leave something in the comments below if you know what other Indo-European languages still have cases. So something we need to understand about historical linguistics is that the tendency of languages is to simplify over time. They simplify, they get muddier, they get watered down. And so, in fact, you'll notice some of the most complex and strange languages are the ones that historically were very geographically isolated. So what's interesting there is that the Slavs did manage to be rather isolated, and other than the Mongol Tatars, they weren't really interacting a whole bunch with outsiders all of that much. And that's why the Slavic languages have mostly maintained a lot of their grammatical complexities. So also, not only do languages in general simplify over time, but Russian simplified over time. Can you believe this insanely difficult Russian that you're currently learning is actually a simplified version of itself? So Russian used to have nasal vowels. It used to have like 50 letters. So like, yeah, you're actually learning a simplified version of Russian. Russian actually used to have 9 cases that don't exist in Russian anymore, or they got kind of swallowed up by a few of the other cases. We'll talk more about them. But the Russian used to have the vocative case, звательный падеж. It also used to have this, look at this, the dual. So you have the singular, the plural, and the dual. Okay, so now let's talk about what needs to happen for languages to change. So the first reason that languages simplify is foreign influence. As I said, the more isolated you are as a language, the less often people are intermingling with people in your culture, the easier it is to keep your language pure and complex. So for example, Finnish, I think, has 12 cases, and sure enough, they're up super far north. They're not really intermingling with conquerors and so on, so they've been able to keep a pretty complex language. Versus people in Western Europe that were part of the Holy Roman Empire, they were all kind of intermingling, and they had Latin influence, and then they were trying to communicate amongst themselves. So it would make sense then that those languages got diluted and or watered down, and they lost their grammar. And they all lost their grammar in a very similar way. Meanwhile, the Slavs are all kind of either associating amongst themselves, or they're associating with people whose languages are completely different, so they can't really blend together the way that the Romance languages of Western Europe could. But what we do need to think about is Russian does have plenty of foreign influence. This is mainly in the vocabulary. We start to, around the time of Peter the Great, we start to see words like bureau, palto, кофе, bra, sushi. So, I mean, not Peter the Great. Sushi was not under Peter the Great. But these are from Western Europe. A lot of them French, a lot of them Italian. And then we have Japanese sushi. That's a new addition. Taxi. A lot of other languages like, words like that are borrowed from a foreign language. And sure enough, they simplify the grammar. They do not change. They don't get cases because the Russian grammar system doesn't know what to do with these. They don't know what gender they are, or maybe they were a different gender originally in French, and so then it's weird in Russian to call it that gender. So what's interesting is a lot of times these foreign words, they don't change, they don't get cases. So maybe if the Russian language gets so many loan words, the cases will automatically disappear because they won't fit the Russian declension system anymore. Another reason that languages change is redundancy. Anytime a sound or a morpheme or a grammatical structure ceases to have a uniqueness to it, it's going to be irrelevant. We don't need 2 of that, right? We don't need 2 of that. So for example, I told you originally there was 9 cases in Russian. Now there's only 6. Well, what happened? There used to be the местный падеж, the locative падеж, which answered the question where something happened. And here, a lot of the masculines would get these u endings, где, в снегу, во рту, на льду, etc. And then, but what's weird is in the prepositional case, they would get a different ending, о снеге. What are you thinking about? О снеге. So originally, those were 2 separate cases. Well, it became redundant. They didn't need an entirely separate case for it, so they just merged it into one case, the prepositional, that just has some weird exceptions. Now, what's interesting is if you're a language nerd, you get to see these live grammar changes in action, specifically happening right now with German. German, the genitive case right before our eyes is dying out. I don't know German. I don't speak German. I know I have a ton of viewers who do, but currently the genitive case is optional and or it's only used in written form, which is always the start of the death of a grammar feature. Okay, so when it's only used in written form, it means people are not interested in it anymore. They're not, and I guarantee you, 50 years, 60 years, the younger generation will not use the genitive case. So right before our eyes, we are seeing that the genitive case in German is getting mixed in with accusative and dative. It does not need its separate category anymore. So it is becoming redundant. The number 3 reason, and this is super interesting, is there's an element of elitism versus there's no stigma with speaking incorrectly. This is a big one. So remember back when I talked about, well, I mean, why did English lose its cases when they were conquered by the French Normans, but Russian didn't lose its cases when it was ruled by the Mongol Tatars for 2 centuries? Great question. Let me tell you the difference. The Normans came in and their language became the language of power, the language of government, the language of business affairs, religion. So if you really wanted to get anywhere in society, you needed to know French Norman. You were not going to be taken seriously without it. Now, the leadership, the Norman leadership didn't really care if you spoke imperfect English. Nobody cared because nobody cared about English grammar anymore. Everybody was focused on, making their way up the social ladder, and therefore they needed Norman French. Now, as opposed to that, and I learned this from my most favorite book that I've read on the Mongol Tatars, I highly recommend it. It's like such an easy, delightful read, is that the Mongol Tatars didn't want their subjects to know the language. They wanted it to kind of be their secret language that separated them from their subjects, the people below them. So that's the difference. You had no incentive to learn Mongol Tatar and just forget Russian, right? You still needed your Russian. Now, of course, Russian was highly influenced by the Mongol Tatar language, and we see it all over in the vocabulary. But if you'll notice, these words tend to be very concrete, and they're words you would have needed just in your basic everyday dealings with your overlords, right? They come into town collecting taxes, деньги. You have to answer to your хозяин, your master. And then you would have been interacting with them in matters of trade. So for example, a kaftan, like a type of shirt, almaz, a diamond. Again, these are very concrete everyday items, whereas the Norman French influence on English was much more abstract and philosophical because those are the things that were being discussed in high society. So one more big why moment, and I am confident in my viewers that you will be able to answer this for me. Why then? Why did almost all the Slavic languages keep their cases except for Bulgarian and Macedonian? And I honestly don't know the answer to this. So I'm counting on my viewers to know the answer to this. And this is your homework. If you were in my linguistics class, I would have you use Bulgarian as a case study. Look at why Bulgarian lost its cases, and does it fit my description of what makes things lose its grammar? So for example, is there foreign influence? Is there redundancy? And lastly, is there an elitism and or lack of stigma if you don't use the cases? Like for example, look at this. This is going to hurt your brain. Живот с эпилепсия. Okay, so живот in Bulgarian means life. Look at this. This is like mind-blowing. So life with epilepsy. No change on the end of those words. In Bulgaria, no change. And then clear down at the bottom, you can't see it because it's super small, but it's like Ассоциация на родителей на деца с эпилепсией. So it's like the association of, but the word for of is na, and then sure enough, parents doesn't change, and then of, na, children with epilepsy. Like it's just so weird. They just completely disappeared. So I have a feeling my viewers will know the answer to this. And then lastly, what other language features, grammatical features, have you seen just poof, just pass on to the next, pass on to grammar heaven because they were no longer appreciated or used in this world? So the example of the German genitive, the Russian vocative, obviously all the cases in English, we don't have them anymore. And then think about it. This currently is in the process of dying. And we're just letting it die. The word whom. Who do you know that actually, whom do you know that actually knows how to use this word correctly? Nobody, right? And guess what? Nobody cares. You are still going to get a job in a big fancy company if you don't know how to use whom. There is no stigma associated with not knowing how to use whom correctly. So let me know in the comments below about more deaths, grammar deaths you've seen languages suffer. And then in our next video, we're going to ask ourselves, are you ready to learn the cases? That's a big moment. Are you ready? And then also strategies to be able to learn them and what you might be doing wrong. Do you feel like you're not making any progress? Well, let's talk in the next video about what you might be doing wrong. Хорошо. Это все. I hope I sufficiently exploded your brain for one day, and I hope you come back for more fun, juicy, exciting information about the beautiful and amazing Russian cases. Хорошо. Это все. До свидания.